I'm Alex, and this story is a messy one. Imagine this, a woman leaving her own husband to die on Everest. Driven by ego and impatience, she treated the mountain and the man beside her like obstacles instead of realities, ignoring every warning that mattered. This follows a sequence so cold and catastrophic, and the revelation at the end is just the cherry on top. This happened on March 14th, 2017. But before that, I want to be upfront about something. This is not one of those Everest stories with clean video evidence and a tidy timeline. What I had to work with was a pile of fragmented accounts, climbers who saw pieces of it, an expedition log that raised more questions than it answered, and one Sherpa named Yonten who was willing to sit down and actually talk to me. Everything you're about to hear was reconstructed from those sources. I filled in no blanks on my own. I only connected the dots that were already there. Part of why this case stayed under the radar is that Everest deaths happen more often than most people realize. Since the mountain was first summited in 1953, over 300 people have died on its slopes. A significant number of those bodies are still up there. The altitude makes recovery so dangerous that it is usually left undone. Deaths on Everest get normalized in a way that deaths almost nowhere else do. They get absorbed into statistics, written up in expedition reports, mourned by small communities and largely forgotten by everyone else. So when two people go up and only one comes back down alive, and then that one also dies during the descent, the story has a way of disappearing into the background noise of the mountain's body count. So how does a story like this almost vanish, unless something about it felt too uncomfortable to examine closely? But this one did not sit right with the people who were there. And once I started pulling on the thread, it did not sit right with me either. And those dots, once connected, form one of the most quietly disturbing pictures I have ever come across in years of covering mountaineering incidents. Seren and Tomas Lopez had been climbing for nearly 3 days straight above Camp 3. They were already in the death zone, above 26,000 feet, where the air holds so little oxygen that your body begins shutting down simply by existing there. At sea level, every breath you take delivers enough oxygen to keep your brain and muscles functioning normally. At 26,000 feet, you are breathing air that contains roughly 1/3 the oxygen of sea level. Your body compensates as hard as it can. Your heart rate climbs, your breathing becomes faster and shallower, your blood thickens. But those compensations only go so far. Supplemental oxygen buys you time, but it does not buy you safety. The longer you stay up there, the more the mountain collects from you. Your judgment dulls, your coordination frays. Your legs feel like they belong to someone else. Some people get severe headaches that no amount of medication touches. Others start making decisions that, at lower altitude, they would recognize immediately as irrational. The death zone is called that because it is accurate. So if judgment is already compromised up there, was this arrogance or something even more dangerous disguised as determination? They were moving toward Camp 4, the last stop before the summit push, and already the accounts from other climbers on the route described the atmosphere between the two of them as uncomfortable. Not the ordinary quiet tension of exhausted people trying to survive, something sharper than that. Other climbers in earshot said Seren was audibly frustrated with Tomas's pace, not in the way someone whispers a worried word to their partner, but in the way someone snaps at a coworker who keeps getting things wrong. She called him dead weight at some point during that stretch. Multiple people remembered that phrase specifically. One climber from a separate. The expedition said he initially assumed they were strangers arguing over a shared fixed line, and was genuinely surprised to learn they were married. Tomas, by contrast, was described consistently as quiet and deliberate. Slow, yes, but methodical. He checked his clips. He took careful steps. A couple of climbers who passed him during the ascent toward Camp 4 said he seemed like the kind of person who had done his homework, who understood that rushing on Everest is how people end up in the news for the wrong reasons. He was also already showing signs of altitude fatigue, moving a little stiffly, pausing more than average. Nothing that screamed emergency yet, just a man working hard against a mountain that does not care how prepared you are. Yonten, the Sherpa who was guiding them, had noticed the friction from the very beginning of the summit push night. He told me the tension between them felt old, like it had been there long before the mountain. He said he tried to stay focused on the climb and not get pulled into whatever was happening between them. He had a job to do. But when personal tension follows you into the death zone, does it stay personal or does it turn fatal? They left Camp 4 in the middle of the night, as most summit teams do. That is not unusual. The standard approach on the Southeast Ridge Route, the same one Sir Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay used in 1953, is to depart somewhere between midnight and 2 in the morning. You want to hit the summit in the late morning hours, giving yourself enough daylight to descend safely before the afternoon weather rolls in. Everest's weather is notoriously unstable in the afternoons, when warming air generates powerful updrafts and wind shifts that have killed climbers who were perfectly fine an hour earlier. The mountain is not forgiving of late starts, and every guide on every reputable expedition drills this into their clients before the push begins. The night was cold, obviously. Temperatures up there in March can drop to around negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit before wind chill, and a line of climbers snaked upward into the dark. Headlamps dotted the slope like a string of fading lights. Wind was present but not alarming, at least not yet. The kind of wind that reminds you where you are without actively threatening you. Seren moved fast. That was the word multiple climbers used. Fast. Not fast in a skilled, efficient way, but fast in an impatient way, like someone trying to get ahead of a line at an airport rather than someone navigating one of the most lethal stretches of terrain on the planet. She pushed past other climbers where the fixed lines allowed it. She turned back multiple times to shout at Tomas, who was falling behind even in those early hours of the push. Not quiet words of encouragement, shouting. Witnesses recalled her voice carrying clearly in the thin air, sharp and irritated, telling him to move faster, to stop holding everyone, to keep up with the pace. One climber described her as someone who seemed to resent being attached to the slowest person in the group, except that person was her husband. And if she already saw him as something holding her back, how far would she go to remove that obstacle? I want to be clear about something. Swearing and venting on a summit push is not unheard of. People under extreme physical and psychological stress say things they would not normally say, but there is a difference between a frustrated outburst and a sustained pattern of behavior, and what was described to me was the latter. Multiple climbers from unrelated expeditions recalled her voice carrying across the slope in the dark. That takes energy you do not have to spare at 27,000 feet. It also tells you something about where her head was. Not focused, not conserving, not managing herself the way you need to on the upper mountain. Janten told me he urged her more than once to slow down. That burning energy. Fast at altitude is a mistake, that you do not have unlimited reserves up there, and every burst of frustration or unnecessary movement costs you oxygen and warmth and focus that you will desperately need later. She did not listen, or she listened and did not care. Tomas, meanwhile, was visibly struggling with rhythm. Getting into a steady breathing pattern on a summit push is crucial. You take a set number of steps, you breathe deliberately, you manage your oxygen flow, and your pace and coordination. He was losing that coordination. Climbers behind him noticed he was stopping more often than he should have been, adjusting his mask, looking back down the slope. He was not in crisis yet, but the gap between him and his wife was growing, and it was the kind of gap that, at that altitude, is very hard to close once it opens. And once that distance sets in, is it something you can fix or something you're forced to accept? The balcony sits at roughly 27,500 feet on the southeast ridge. It is a wide, flattish ledge carved into the ridgeline, and it serves as a natural rest point, one of the few places on the upper mountain where climbers can stop, check oxygen levels, swap bottles if needed, and take stock of whether continuing is a realistic option. Most guides consider the balcony the last real decision point. Turn around here, and you have a fighting chance of getting down under your own power. Push past it when something is already wrong, and the calculus changes completely. Tomas stopped at the balcony for an extended rest, not a quick pause, a real stop, sitting down, head bowed. The other climbers around him gave him space. Janten came back to check on him, and later told me that Tomas's breathing was labored and his responses were slower than they should have been. Not incoherent, but sluggish. Janten recommended they slow the pace significantly, or consider turning around. Seren rejected this immediately, because at that moment, what mattered more to her, the man sitting in front of her, or the summit still above them. By multiple accounts, she argued that they were losing their summit window, that the weather was fine, that Tomas just needed to push through it. The argument at the balcony was loud enough that climbers from at least 2 other expeditions heard it. One of them, a Romanian climber who later gave a detailed account to a mountaineering forum, described her voice as relentless. Not panicked, not emotional, just relentlessly insistent that they keep moving. Tomas, from what that same climber could tell, said very little. He asked her to wait. She refused. She left the balcony with Janten. Tomas was still sitting when they moved on. I want to say something here, and it is purely my opinion, but I think it matters. The decision to leave the balcony in that situation is not just a bad judgment call. It is a willingness to treat another person's life as a logistical inconvenience. Everest is not a place where you get the benefit of the doubt. The mountain is not going to give you a second chance to correct a mistake made at 27,500 feet. Anyone who has spent serious time studying high high-altitude mountaineering knows that the balcony is exactly the kind of moment where relationships either hold together or reveal what they actually are. What happened at the balcony told you everything about what was coming next. Above the balcony, the terrain shifts. The ridge narrows and the exposure becomes very real. On one side, an almost vertical drop into Tibet. On the other, the southwest face falling away into Nepal. The fixed lines here are your lifeline in the most literal sense. Climbers move single file, clipping and unclipping methodically, always maintaining contact with the rope. There is no room for carelessness and no margin for exhaustion. This is also the section where, in most years, the highest concentration of summit day deaths occur. Not from dramatic accidents, but from the slow accumulation of everything wrong with a person's condition that they refuse to acknowledge lower on the mountain. And if mistakes compound up here, how far can someone really push before the mountain starts collecting its due? Tomas attempted to continue after the balcony. He got back to his feet and started moving again, which I think says something about the kind of person he was. He did not give up easily. A climber who had passed him coming down later reported seeing him on this section of the ridge, and the picture she painted was not good. He was stumbling, not dramatically, not falling, but his footwork was unreliable. He missed a step and caught himself. He reached for a clip and struggled with the mechanism, fingers fumbling with something that should have been automatic. His movements had the quality of someone operating on the edge of their functional capacity, grinding through each motion by sheer will rather than coordination. The climber who reported this told me she considered stopping to help him. She decided against it. Her own oxygen was limited. Her own guide was urging her forward, and Tomas was not yet in a state where intervention seemed clearly necessary. That is the brutal arithmetic of the upper mountain. Everyone is fighting to survive. Stopping to save someone else can mean not making it back yourself. She moved on. I do not blame her for that, but she told me she thought about him often afterward. He was essentially alone at this point. The climbers who had been near him at the balcony had moved on. Serene and Yonten were well ahead. He existed in the gap between groups, visible to no one with any reason to stop. Just below the Hillary Step, a near vertical rock face roughly 40 feet tall that sits just below the summit at about 28,800 feet and was considered for decades the final technical obstacle before the top. Tomas sat down, and he did not get back up. The Hillary Step had partially collapsed 2015 earthquake, and by 2017 it had become a steep snow slope rather than a technical rock pitch. But the altitude and exposure were unchanged. Climbers passing through that section reported seeing him seated against the slope, mostly still. His oxygen mask was on, his head was down. A few climbers stopped long enough to check on him and got minimal response. Not unconscious, but barely present. The blank, slow blinking look that, at that altitude, everyone with experience recognized immediately. Word reached Seren. A climber coming up behind her passed along what was happening. By the most consistent account across multiple sources, her response was dismissive. She said, and this is reported by two separate people, that he always did this, that he always overdramatized, that he would be fine. She continued upward, and once she made that choice, was there any version of this story where she turns around? I have spent a lot of time sitting with that moment. The accounts are clear. The situation was clear. At 28,800 feet, a person exhibiting those symptoms is not overdramatizing. A person sitting down and not getting back up at that altitude is in the process of dying. Everybody who has ever studied a high-altitude death knows exactly what that looks like, and it looks exactly like what Tomas looked like. Seren had been on Everest before. She was not a novice. She did not misread the situation. I do not believe for a second that she misread it. She chose the summit. Serene and Yonten reached the top sometime in the late morning. I do not have a precise time. Yonten was careful about the details he shared with me, and the expedition log from their outfitter was vague on specifics. What Yonten described was a summit stop that was quiet and brief. No tears, no embracing. He said she took out a camera and documented herself standing there, though those photos never appeared publicly. He said she spent more time looking at the sky and checking the wind than anything else, like she was already calculating the descent. The weather was shifting, nothing dramatic yet, a gradual uptick in wind, some thin cloud movement at the ridgeline. The kind of change that experienced climbers learn to read quickly, because on Everest, gradual changes have a way of becoming violent ones fast. Yonten told me she seemed almost anxious to leave, not relieved, not triumphant, just finished the way you are finished with a task rather than the way you are finished with a dream. So if there was no sense of achievement, what was she actually chasing all the way up there? They turned around and started down. Behind them, Tomas was confirmed dead. Climbers descending from their own summit bids passed him and found no signs of life. He had died where he sat, in the snow, just below the Hillary Step, at an elevation where the human body simply cannot sustain itself without consistent oxygen flow and the will to keep moving. His body remained in place. At that altitude, body recovery is not feasible. The risk to any recovery team would be too great, the logistics impossible. He joined the roughly 200 or so bodies that still remain on the upper mountain, people who went up and did not come down, who became landmarks that other climbers pass on their way to the top. His death almost certainly occurred during the window in which Seren was standing on the summit. The descent started badly and got worse. Wind speeds climbed above what they had been on the way up. Visibility started cutting in and out. Not a full whiteout, but the kind of intermittent obscuring that makes route finding genuinely difficult and depth perception unreliable on hard ice. In good visibility, the fixed lines serve as a clear guide. In the kind of shifting murk that was settling over the ridge, even experienced climbers second-guessed their orientation. Yontin told me he was telling Seren repeatedly to slow down, that she was moving too fast for the conditions, that fatigue was catching up with her coordination. She had been burning energy aggressively all morning. The summit push had taken everything she had. What was left was not much. There is something that gets said a lot about Everest, and I want to repeat it here because it genuinely matters. The descent is where the mountain kills most people, not the ascent. People train and obsess and prepare for the climb up, and then they reach the top completely spent, with their oxygen running low and their legs destroyed and their judgment compromised. And then they have to get back down the same technical terrain they just came up. The summit is the halfway point, not the finish line. Statistics back this up. The majority of Everest fatalities occur on the way down. The climbers who survive are the ones who understand that. The ones who treat the summit as the end of the work are the ones who end up in the reports. Seren was moving like someone who thought the hard part was over. The accident happened on a narrow traverse above the south summit at somewhere around 28,700 feet. The section requires careful movement. One side drops away steeply, and the fixed lines need to be managed precisely during transitions between anchor points. You unclip from one section, move to the next anchor, clip back in. It sounds simple. At sea level, it would be simple. At 28,700 feet, exhausted and oxygen depleted and moving too fast for the conditions, it was not simple. There is also a specific kind of tunnel vision that sets in on a long, hard descent. Your brain narrows its focus. You stop processing the full picture and start processing only the next step, the next clip, the next anchor. That narrowing keeps you moving, but it also makes you vulnerable to the thing you are not fully tracking. A gust of wind, a patch of hard ice you misread as softer snow, a crampon that has not been checked since hours ago when your hands were less numb and your attention was more available. A strong gust came through, sharper than the wind pattern that had been building, sudden enough that Yontin, behind her by a few feet, had to brace himself against the slope with his ice axe. She was mid-transition, unclipped from one anchor, and moving to clip into the next. The gust hit while her crampon was repositioning on the ice surface. The front points did not set properly. Her boot skated sideways. She slipped. Initially, it looked controlled, or at least that is what Yontin described, that terrible half-second where a fall looks like it might be caught. But momentum is merciless on that angle of slope. What started as a sideways skate became a slide, and the slide became a fall. The accounts on whether she was fully unclipped or just improperly clipped vary, and I have not been able to resolve them. It may not matter. The outcome was the same. She went down the face. Within seconds, she was out of sight, swallowed by the terrain below. Yontin called out. There was no response. Other climbers in the area confirmed they saw her fall. No one was positioned to do anything. Yontin tried to track where she had gone by watching the slope below. The wind and the terrain made that impossible almost immediately. There was no viable line down to where she had fallen. The face she went down was not accessible from the route, not at that altitude, not with the wind picking up. Other climbers in the vicinity confirmed what Yontin already knew. She was unrecoverable. The declaration came quickly because it had to. On the upper mountain, there is no prolonged search and rescue infrastructure. There are no helicopters that can operate reliably above 23,000 feet. There are no ropes long enough, and no teams willing to risk descending a broken face in deteriorating weather to retrieve someone whose survival, given the fall and the altitude, was essentially impossible. She was declared gone, and Yontin, after spending what time he safely could, trying to see anything useful below, had to make the decision that all mountain guides eventually face. Keep standing still on an exposed ridge in deteriorating conditions, or save himself. He kept moving. He got down. He told me afterward that the hardest part was not the fall itself. That happened in seconds, faster than he could fully process. The hardest part was walking down alone. past the place on the ridge where Tomas was sitting, knowing that both of them were staying on the mountain. In the weeks after, I spoke with the sister of Tomas, a woman we'll call Renata, who agreed to talk to me on the condition that I not use her real name. She was quiet and precise in the way of someone who has already processed most of their grief and arrived at something harder than sadness. She described the marriage as strained for years. Frequent arguments, extended silences, the kind of emotional distance that both people eventually stopped trying to cross. She said Seren had been involved with someone else in the period before the expedition, and that Tomas had known about it, and that the Everest climb had been her idea, her goal, something she had been building toward for years before she and Tomas ever met. Renata said she always believed her brother went on the climb, hoping it would fix something between them, that he thought sharing something enormous might rebuild what had eroded. The mountain, she said, had just made visible what was already true.